And we are live. I'm very excited to welcome David Crowley of Social Capital Incorporated to the show. David and I actually met through a sort of networking accident on LinkedIn. I was commenting on somebody else's post. There was a little confusion. He responded to my post. That somehow turned into coffee, and here we are on a podcast about networking together. David, we always like to start off the show by asking our guests, what is a cool networking event or networking story that you have from recently?
Sure, Jeff. Thanks for having me. Well, let's see. I'm going to a cool networking event tomorrow. The local chambers in the area are doing their multi-chamber events at rotating breweries. So there's one in Melrose at Hannah's Brewery tomorrow night, but that's in the future. You asked about something in the past. So I do have a cool networking story, which is I had reached out to somebody who's in our SCI network for lunch recently, and in the conversation, I learned that he had actually come to an event we have that facilitates networking as in learning, and he had connected with someone there, and I learned he joined their board of directors as a result of coming to our event. So it was nice. We really like our events to have people connect and connect with what we're doing, but connect with each other. And when they actually that connection leads to something fruitful like that, that was pretty cool for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always cool when those when cool connections end up happening. It's amazing. The more you do it, the more I feel like those things happen. Well, tell us a little bit before we dive into sort of your networking experience and background, and sort of tell us a little bit about SCI.
Sure. So Social Capital Inc., or SCI for short, we are a nonprofit organization based in Woburn, serving the greater Boston community. And our mission and theme ties in very well with your podcast, because we are all about cultivating connections. The idea that the more we bring people together of different backgrounds to work on our common problems, that's really the best way over the long term to build strong, healthy communities. So we do that through a variety of leadership development programs, community events, and all kinds of other fun stuff.
Yeah. Well, when you and I met, I was like, wow, this is like you said, it's exactly the kind of thing that we are interested in, sort of, cultivating and connecting with, and whatever. How do you sort of build things in Boston? But I would love to hear from you a little bit more about how did you start this? Where did this idea come from?
Oh, that's a very good question. So there were really two key drivers to it. One is, so I grew up in Woburn, as you know, suburb north of Boston, went to the schools here, but then went off to college, actually lived for 5 years in Kentucky. Didn't expect to come back to live in my hometown. But lo and behold, as others might know, sometimes your hometown has a pull, and we found ourselves coming back to Woburn. In my case, my wife was from South Dakota, so it was not coming back home for her, but coming back home. So really, even though I'd been in the nonprofit sector, I had the disconnect of doing nonprofit work, but not feeling really connected to a place that was really my community. So when I moved back to Woburn, I was really interested in sinking my teeth into what was going on and how could I lend my skills and get involved in an impactful way. But had noticed the community had really been changing a lot, getting more diverse. The good thing, but it also meant that there were some challenges around how do you still build that strong sense of community as communities are changing. I had these thoughts kicking around without any framework or thing to call them when I read a book, speaking of books again, Jeff, called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, a Harvard professor. Some of you might have heard of it, but basically that book really tells the story of declining sense of people knowing their neighbors and being active in community life. And he really popularized the term social capital, which is now used a lot, but it was a new concept when he wrote that book. And so I had the idea that we could start in my community of trying to create a model of how do we intentionally build strong communities where people are connecting, working together, despite social forces that might have us doing less so in current times.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And I'm curious, so when you're saying bringing communities together, which I think is such a special thing to do, and that's really where, minds really start going to and ideas, but what's like one of the first steps or how do you really get that to fruition?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I always think about like building community, cultivating connections, kind of an abstract concept. So from day one, I thought like finding like a tangible, things that people could sink their teeth into. As a general point, how we actually started, I decided to organize our first community programs. Now, this is going back over 20 years, but it was getting close to the first anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And so we developed this idea of creating a civic engagement week where people could do all kinds of things at a time that was going to be difficult, the first time remembering the terrible attacks, to do a bunch of positive things in community. So it involved like, working with the different church groups to do a dialogue about, where things stand a year later. We actually had a volunteer project where we planted 911 daffodils in a place in Woburn. So it was really like a range, like it was creating a menu of different ways people could connect and engage, and it gave people a lot of different ways that could come out and participate in the community. And that kind of formula, not necessarily that particular event, but that kind of concept of given a lot of choices, because some people might like that hands-on. Yeah, I want to just do something tangible after a day at work. Other people really want to dig into, I want to talk about topical issues with people. So we really feel that giving people a variety of ways that they can connect is an important way to go, and then be very intentional about inviting people from different backgrounds into whatever you're doing. That's really a core premise of ours.
That's great. And I think the intentionality there goes a long way. I think when people first maybe go to one of your events, they probably see that and want to keep participating because of, that aspect of it. But then also, I think it's really creative for you to say, there's some folks that like to, be hands-on, do something, planting daffodils, or it's more perspective and mind and strategy. So I think you're catering to a lot of different people, which hopefully in return has a really big outcome too, right? So that's really nice.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we definitely have had a lot of success because, it gets people. And at the end of the day, sometimes even though we might be, seeing higher levels of isolation for a variety of reasons, people love to connect. You can feel the energy in a room, whether it's, one of our events or, the kind of networking things that you spotlight here. When it's going well, there's that vibrancy and energy that, because at the end of the day, we're social beings.
Do you find that people are, so you've talked about this sort of like people used to be, I guess partly because there was no social media, whatever, like people used to be much more connected with the people around them, whatever. Do you find that people are sort of, they love to connect, but are they resistant to it at first? Like, is there sort of it's like a barrier? People don't want to, like they're afraid to do it, but then when they do it, they realize they like it. Have you noticed that at all? Or
Yeah, I think there's sometimes, it's easy, you can get a mode. It's either to go home, watch television, or be on your phone after work or something. But I think one of the other barriers I have found is sometimes historically, some of the ways people connected was through joining something, whether it be, a civic group like Rotary Kiwanis, or being a regular member of a religious institution where there was a structure to showing up, on a schedule. I think like one of the fears now, or is like a little bit of a fear of, oh, can I commit to this? If it is something that's like an ongoing commitment, I think that is where I feel there's hesitancy, just because I feel our lives just have gotten so busy, sometimes in a way, technology is a way to pack more in. I mean, if you're doing meetings virtually, like we're talking, you can cram more into a day. So I think there's a little hesitancy I find about like things that feel like a commitment. So that's something I find.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things we always like to ask folks is how did you get started networking, and what do you wish you had known when you started networking that you know now that you wish somebody had told you?
Oh, well, those are very good questions. I think, I've been, I've probably been doing it for decades. So I'm trying to think back to, early lessons. I feel like I probably did the most when I the first job I had, I spent 5 years in Kentucky, and it was government funded, so I probably had to do less networking than I did when I came back to the Boston area and I was running another nonprofit. I guess that's probably where I would say I really started, feeling like I need to get into a routine and doing it regularly. And I would say, I would start getting to events, finding different, opportunities. I did a program called Lead Boston that some of you might be familiar with. So there were some structured ways I was able to plug into, as well as, trying to figure out, the Boston Foundation, for instance, regularly hosts events that are both educational, but also tend to have space for networking. So I would, avail myself of things like that. The other thing I would, in terms of the other side of your question, what I wish I knew then, I would say, tips around, I actually, whenever I do like a Myers-Briggs or something like that, I score introvert, I'm kind of close on the line there. So I'm not like hardcore introvert, but what really makes, resonates with me about introvert is like, after I go to a networking event, honestly, like I've been there long enough. I need to unwind, and read a book or something when I get home to re-energize. I think highly extroverted people, can talk at a cocktail party for 4 or 5 hours and not be tired. So I think like learning about different styles and understanding that it's okay that maybe if you're not feeling inside, like, oh gee, I'm not the life of the party, or I'm maybe feeling a little uncomfortable about reaching out, like I remember somebody telling me there are other people in the room, that are going to feel similarly to you.
Yeah.
And, the tip of like, maybe, okay, don't necessarily try to break into that conversation with 6 people that seem like they've known each other forever and they're having a grand old time. Find somebody else who's maybe looking for that person to chat with, to get your feet wet or something like that.
Totally. The bar, I find, is always a good spot when you go to an event, you don't know anyone. It's an easy way to kind of like sneak right in and be like, oh, look at what are you drinking? And you kind of can naturally start a conversation. And I love that you bring up being an introvert too, because I think that's like a common theme we have on this podcast.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
We have a lot of people who are really big networkers who are more introverted by nature. And we like to talk about how I think a lot of times that makes you a good networker because you have it's easier for you to actively listen in a conversation and I'm right on that line, but I know it can be, an extrovert just wanting to word vomit a little bit and that overwhelms the introvert. We talk about too, everyone's there to have fun and get to know each other. So it makes it a really great place for introverts to go out and build connections as well. So speaking on that, is there any tips and tricks you have as somebody who tends to be more introverted that kind of helps you so if you're going to an event and you're like, wow, I'm not really feeling it, like I don't want to go, but I have to go. What are some tips and tricks that you kind of pep yourself up with?
Yeah. One is I feel like I've gotten better over time, like picking events that are going to make sense to be at. Like, it's not always the case, but I will do things like look at the speaker list, kind of think about, who's likely to be in the room because of that. Some events actually will post who's coming, which, isn't a bad idea. So, sometimes I will look at that, A, to decide if I want to go, B, if then I think, I've identified, somebody else on the program and a couple people that are guests, and I have in mind, okay, I at least want to connect with those 3 people, something like that. So going in with a little preparation helps. I mean, honestly, I don't always do that, but when I've definitely found, like when I do a little prep like that is definitely, I think you go in a little more confident and a little more focused too.
Right. Setting goals for yourself. Really.
Yeah. And you also mentioned too, like, sometimes, which I definitely understand that feeling, is you might feel drained afterwards, right? Like you're there being very sociable, and then you just take a seat on the couch for a second and have a breather. So I think there's so much value with going to events and doing in-persons. But there is, and we talk about this a lot, there is such as too much, right? And kind of
Right.
burning yourself out. And I think being picky and choosy is very good, because then it's, what can I get out of it? Whether that be education, whether that be great connects. Also sometimes going, I don't know if any of you have had this, but I've done my research. I really want to at least talk to these 3 people before going. And there's been times when I wasn't able to connect with them just because pretty popular, and again, big groups surrounding them. So I didn't have a chance.
Mhm.
But the follow-up via email or on LinkedIn afterwards was a lot more smooth, being able to reference, hey, I was there, great takeaways, would love to connect over lunch or coffee. And that helps out. So I don't know if any of you had that experience before.
I definitely do that pretty regularly, because I don't like, especially, some events, it's a fairly short window of time, maybe after a speaking program or what have you. And do you want to spend the entire thing in line to talk to one person?
Right.
I will sometimes like look at the line and be like, especially occasionally, like sometimes it's like someone, not that I don't know at all, but I haven't seen in a while, and I just want to do a reconnect. I'm like, well, I'm not going to necessarily wait in that line to reconnect with John. This is a good excuse for me to reach out and, try to have coffee later or something, or just even reference his remarks or something like that. I think that's totally a good strategy.
Yeah. And we talked about it too, and one of our other guests mentioned this, but when you're in a conversation, be in the conversation. So to your point, sometimes you talk to, the same person the whole entire time, and that's okay. But you want a connection is still a connection and important nonetheless. And being a unfocused conversation is never the best taste in someone's mouth. So I think, to your point, it happens more times than not.
Right.
So I have a question for all 3 of you, because I've been thinking about this one a lot, because I've noticed that I have started to use this specific way of breaking into a conversation. So I'd be interested to see if you all have. So my go-to line right now is it okay if I crash this conversation? And that it always works. It never feels awkward. Nobody's ever said no, but I'm just interested to hear, like, do you all have something that you specifically use as here's how I break into a conversation?
I mean, it's the same thing, but like way less creative. I'm generally just like, can I join you guys? So
people have said that to, like, if I'm in a group though, Jeff, some people would say that and we're like, of course, like, please, one, feel, prized for you to want to talk to us and like kind of jump in, but absolutely. David, you mentioned this in Amelia, but for events that maybe it's not the industry that I'm used to or the topic, I'm a little out of my comfort zone, I'll go, to your point, right to the bar. Or if it's a daytime thing where the tea and coffee is, just keep filling her up and people are going to naturally, get in conversation.
Yeah.
I'll do that sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good approach, Jeff. I should think about that. I think I tend to, if I'm looking, I'm often looking, is there someone I know or at least like recognize in the group that I can say hello to integrate into the conversation. But yeah, it's probably good to have but that's not always possible. Having a way in is good.
Because there's some events where you go and and I've done this where I've been like the only person I know at the event, and I show up and it's everybody else knows other people there because they came with their coworkers. Yeah. So you're just you're kind of walking around being like, oh yeah, you're all coworkers. Oh, and so the bar is always a great place because that's generally where also the other solo people end up going.
Right.
So you just it's so easy as you're waiting for the drink. Oh, what are you doing? What are you drinking? What brought you here? And kind of pick up a conversation. Oh, who else do you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes you can latch on to them, not in the bad way. Don't harass people. But just be like, oh, who else are you here with? Oh, I'd love to meet them. Try to keep it as casual and normal as possible. Although networking feels so outside of a normal interaction.
So I remember, Taylor and Amelia both know that I really didn't do very much networking for a really long time because I was in corporate jobs and I just didn't really need to. And so when I first started doing networking, in the Boston area, when I left my corporate role, I used to say this thing to myself. I said, I only need to be the second most introverted person in the room, and then I'll be fine, right? Because I'll just find that one other person who looks lost and walked up to them. And so that was a good way. But I actually am fascinated now, David. I know that just from watching your LinkedIn posts or whatever, that you do stuff with that SCI does stuff with youth.
Yes.
And so I'm fascinated to hear, do you, as part of that, do you have to train, young folks to network? Do they have to sort of learn, or do you tend to get more outgoing folks that are already doing it?
We do definitely do some training with them, and particularly our AmeriCorps fellows. They're basically young, typically young professionals, maybe a year out of college is common, sometimes even a little younger. So we definitely do some training with them. So, some of the things we're talking about that have already been said, some other things, but just especially, I guess, I hate to be like, oh, this older guy said, talking about the younger generation, but there is some aspect to some of the social skills of, some basics, handshakes, look people in the eye. You can't assume stuff. And I think also, we think about equity a lot in our work, I think we're doing a disservice if we're in the space of training people about this stuff to assume they know this or that because they would have learned it through school or families. Because maybe some in our group would know these things coming in, but if we don't make them explicit, it becomes another barrier. If there's some awkwardness because somebody's not comfortable in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. You were starting to talk to us. You hear a lot about people saying, "Oh, sort of the kids these days," kind of thing. And I wonder, do you feel like that the issues are? I have a strong opinion that I will hold off on here on this, but do you feel like kids these days are actually any different from like, say, when we were younger, or is it really just the same and we've just sort of forgotten what it was like? Is it really truly different because of the technology and so forth?
I don't think young people today are like at the core different in a significant way internally, but I do think social norms are definitely I think that's where there can be a disconnect in my mind, is maybe the social norms, like with what's okay, with a peer group is not going to be okay if you're at a professional networking event. Like if you're in the middle of in a circle of people in a conversation and you're looking down at your phone more than you're looking at the people in the room, that or that you're engaged in a conversation with, that's a problem. So I guess that's what I see as a little, difference in norms. And, it is something that I think, people, who are new in their career not everybody, but there's some that are going to need some mentoring and guidance on topics like this.
Yeah. And I think that's important too. That's a really fascinating question, Jeff, because I never really thought of it that way. But with the phone specifically, and then just certain social norms, maybe, kids now at certain ages don't need to necessarily have to do certain things as quick as other generations. But I do think that it's important to know, just because even if your job isn't for networking, we always talk about it's incredibly beneficial, but the transferable skills, right? Just being a respectful employee, professional growth. There's a lot that are just, I don't know if you always learn in college either too, right? Depends on what your degree is in classes, but I think it's a really, really impactful. So what you're doing with the youth groups, I think that's incredible work.
Yeah, I will say, I was saying, I have a strong opinion about this. My opinion is, I think we all, I was a kid who didn't, when I was like, I remember like if somebody was like, you need to call and order a pizza, I was like deathly like afraid of I'm not calling on the phone. And of course there wasn't, you couldn't text or go online or whatever, you had to call. And I just did not want to do that. And was really, really, shy about that stuff and so forth. And so I guess my take is, I guess the technology is different, but I think that the issue is the same, that ultimately networking is a skill that we all end up having to learn. And if we don't learn it, then, we don't become, we can't become great networkers. And, I remember, being in business school and they were like teaching us how to do a handshake or whatever, but I really don't remember them saying like, this is how you, kind of navigate a networking event. Especially, it's fascinating with kids, kids, they're not kids, adults, young adults in business schools or whatever. Like a lot of, at least while they're in business school, a lot of the events they're going to are career events. And so knowing what, how do I get into a conversation, and how do I not come on too strong, and how do I not like, go in and like, go for the job, before I even, like this idea that like you would never walk up to a person and be like, will you give me a job? And yet,
Right.
somehow that's what people do. Like, hey, do you have any jobs for me? Is kind of like, what
Yeah.
happens. So I think you have to train people to like understand like how to do this stuff. It is not obvious. And I think that's all, that part's always been true.
That's
Yeah.
totally, yeah.
And I don't know if all of us had this experience, but I think it's like trial and error too. There's been plenty of times, especially early on for me, where I left the networking event or some type of event in that way, feeling incredibly awkward and, kind of down on myself. But I think you learn as you go as well, and like get to fit your true personality in. We were going to add something onto that, Amelia.
Oh, I mean, on that point, I think also being intentional about exactly what David said at the beginning of this conversation, of being intentional about the events you're going to, because if, like, for example, I went to an event last week and I was a service provider. Everyone else was founders and investors. And that's a little bit of a different market to talk to because, truthfully, most of these founders are way smarter than me. Like, I'm serious, like they start telling me what they're doing. I'm like, cool. Like, but being able to really be socially aware and kind of drive the conversation and be able to ask more valuable questions of, instead of being, hey, can you explain this to me like a kindergartner? Because I definitely ask that question all the time, but also, how did you come up with this idea? Why are you passionate about it? And really tailoring your questions to your audience as well, so you don't come out of those events feeling awkward. Because, sometimes when you are networking with people that aren't necessarily like you're not their peer, because, like, for example, I'm a service provider and you're a founder, like maybe we're peers in the social world, but in networking, you're somebody I want to sell to eventually. So how do I build a relationship with you without pushing my own product on you instead? So trying to figure out ways to really center the conversation around them to get them talking and fill and really become more of an equal and more of a trusted person versus somebody who's just like, here's my business card.
Yeah, and asking questions, like leading
Right.
with questions, that's just such a great networking tip in general. Obviously good questions, but I remember someone doing a training for us on networking. One of their points was like, you ask enough questions, like usually if you're asking good questions and the other person does, the majority of the talking, they're probably going to leave feeling, oh, that was a good conversation. People like the opportunity to share their expertise, and feel like somebody cares about, enough
People
to ask good questions.
Is
People
that
love talking about themselves.
Isn't that like the Dale Carnegie, like be more interested than interesting thing or whatever?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we have this half an hour has, as promised, flown by. David, this has been a great conversation. Before we wrap up, we like to ask everyone, what's a cool networking event you've got coming up? So would love to hear from you. David, I'll let you start, but is there a cool networking event that you've got on the horizon?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to start with one of my own. You said that was okay. So SEI every year does an event called the Idealist Presentation. We present community awards to some outstanding leaders in the community. In addition to recognizing great people, we really get a great mix of people from business, nonprofit, education together. And that's May 7th in the evening at the Multicultural Arts Center in Cambridge. So I'd invite folks to check that out, to support a good cause and meet a lot of great people.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. And before we go to the rest of us, what is the best place if people want to reach out to you, learn more about SCI? What's the best place for people?
Two things. To connect with me personally, definitely reaching out on LinkedIn, mention that you saw that this podcast would be great. Then I'll know you're legit, somebody would definitely want to connect with. Go to socialcapitalinc.org to learn more about SCI, including that event I mentioned is on the homepage.
Got it. Awesome. Taylor, Amelia, upcoming event?
Yeah, you can go, Taylor.
Yeah, so I'm actually in Rhode Island this week. So no networking events, but I have a lot of partners and clients in the state. So went to a lunch earlier today, have a couple coffees until Friday. So no events per se, but a lot of the in-persons, follow-ups from events. So it's always nice to get that in-person feel. David, you mentioned the world is, virtual in so many ways, which is great. I completely feel you on it gets a little jam-packed sometimes, but when people are local, I do try to at least once in the first couple of months of knowing someone, grab a coffee, meet in person. It's a nice feeling.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Amelia?
Yeah. So I have a bunch of events this week. Tomorrow, I'm excited. The UN is hosting an International Women's Day event at the Boston Public Library. So I recently joined World Women in Trade of New England. It's a networking group that a banker friend of mine referred me into, and she's on the board, and they have some cool events, and they're co-hosting it with the UN. So I'm excited to kind of see what that's all about. And I'm also going to a private dinner on Wednesday night that is being hosted by Fidelity Private Shares. So I'm really excited. Looks like there's like 30 or 40 people on the list. So I'm really excited to meet everyone going and kind of see what it's all about.
And I will finish up then with the only sort of networking event I think I have this week is that the Charles River Chamber has a speed networking event. And I'm super excited because I actually surprisingly have never been to a speed networking event. And so I'm looking.
I think you're going to like it. They're fun.
I think that will be fun. Anyway, David, thank you so much for joining us. This has been super insightful and fun. And so really glad to have had you on the show.
Thanks. It's been fun.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
All right.